Good evening. Hi, welcome to the New York Society Library, both those of you in the members room with us and those of us joining online. I am Sarah Holliday, the library's head of events, and I'm just here briefly to welcome you and to say a quick word about tonight's presenter. As we begin, we acknowledge that the library stands on traditional lands of the Lenape people and other indigenous peoples to whom we pay respect. We're pleased to be able to offer a vibrant season of events with authors like tonight's event. Major events are generally open to the public, so please take a look at our website or speak to a staff member to learn more about what's coming up. I also want to let you know that we are live streaming and recording tonight's event, as well as taking photographs, so please keep that in mind. I'm very pleased to welcome Maximilian Hess to the members room. Mr. Hess is visiting us from London, where he works as a political risk analyst, writer, advisor, and foreign policy consultant, and serves as a non-resident fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. His writing credits include the Financial Times, New Statesman, Al Jazeera, the Moscow Times, Foreign Policy, and the Telegraph, among others. Tonight he's bringing us his new book, Economic War, Ukraine and the Global Conflict Between Russia and the West. Many of us, of course, have been glued to the headlines since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022, so additional context is welcome. Michelle Caruso-Cabrera, the former chief international correspondent for CNBC, says, "Economic war shows how trade, finance, and information are the new battlegrounds in a world where traditional warfare is becoming obsolete. A unique perspective on the largest crisis in Europe since the Cold War, this is a must-read for anyone seeking a better understanding of the conflict and its implications for global politics." We will have copies of tonight's book for purchase from our friends from the Corner Bookstore just outside this room, and the link to purchase books online is in the live stream chat. Also, we would like to make sure to include some substantial question and answer, yes, after the main presentation. So please think of some good questions and comments throughout the presentation.
Sarah, could you remind the members of the annual fund?
Thank you, Carol. Absolutely. This is annual fund time. If you'd like to go to our website, nysociallive.org, and there's a big orange donate button right there at the bottom. Obviously, we are supported by an endowment and membership dues, but those do not cover the full range of our building maintenance, events, programming activities of all kind, as well as, of course, the books, which are really the heart of the place. And we appreciate your support very much. I'm sure that Ms. Malone, who gave me an excellent cue, is happy to speak to you about that if you have further questions, and so am I. So thank you very much. Good. I'm now pleased to welcome to the lectern Maximilian Hess.
Well, thank you all so much for joining tonight, both so many friends and family who are here, some who I've known since I was in middle school, others who've had the misfortune of knowing me slightly briefer periods of time, but with some amazing adventures along the way. And I also in particular have to give a shout out to Patrick McGinnis over there, who is himself an author of a wonderful book called The 10% Entrepreneur and the coiner of the term FOMO, but who I really want to shout out to because he is the one who, when I was writing this book and sat down and, trying to think of how do I actually approach this, I think I had written, maybe 6 or 7 outlines by that time. Patrick was kind enough to get on the phone with me, and he said, that meme where you see the crazy guy with, Post-it notes on the wall writing it? He said, that's actually what you want to do. And you want to come up with the stories that you tell and that you've told me and others and write them down and then find a way to put them together. So the actual narrative structure of the book, which despite my editor's best efforts, is largely still as I came up with it originally, and his wonderful support in refining it, but is thanks to a conversation I had with Patrick. So thank you very much for that and for coming here tonight. I think, are we ready with the IT? Well, while we get started on that, I guess I'll give you a quick background about myself and sort of my approach to this book and its core theses. I've been fascinated by Russia and the post-Soviet region since I was a young man. I went to boarding school in Switzerland, where many of my closest friends were Russians, Ukrainians, and Georgians, Uzbeks, all over the region. I sort of sat down at the wrong table on my first day, and they adopted me. And it's really the economic ties that Russia has to the region that first interested me and first really got me hooked. But the core thesis of the book actually is that it's much larger than just about the economy of Russia or Ukraine. Certainly I will talk about those things, but really that the fight that we're having with Russia has this second additional dimension. So when I say that, I want to define the economic war, of course, the title of the book itself. And this is not to detract from the very real tragedies of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. People are dying every day. Russian missiles strike wonderful cities. Odessa was hit today. Zaporozhye was hit yesterday. Kharkiv, Kherson, Kiev. Many of these wonderful cities have been devastated. And the one closest to my own heart, because I had the good fortune to travel there many times in 2014, 15, and 2016, the city of Mariupol in southeastern Ukraine was, of course, tragically and horrifyingly destroyed last year at the beginning of the conflict. And what I hope to, if anything, add with the book, and one of the core theses about it, is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not just an affront to the liberal values that we have and to the ideas of sovereignty and the principle that a country should not change another's borders by aggression, but is really part of a larger strategy that Vladimir Putin has to try to overturn the international order as it exists. And Ukraine is undoubtedly the key front in this, and tragically they are the ones suffering with their own lives and fighting to defend us. But even for those who don't believe that in the sort of security aspects of the conflict in Ukraine, or don't see that the West is at threat from Russia's actions there, I certainly hope that I can at least explain my opinion as to why that is very much the case. So when I talk about that, what I want to first emphasize is what I mean by the international order. And personally, I don't believe that there's such a thing as the rules-based order. We heard that term thrown around quite a lot in the beginning of this conflict. Certainly, I think what we see happening now in Gaza and Israel speaks to the lack of existence of that order. But the truth is that there is an international economic order. We have financial and economic structures that tie us together and that have helped the world grow with some costs. I'm not saying that the international capitalist system is perfect, but that really drive the world together and actually sit at the core of U.S. hegemony. And what I mean by that is that I think that the United States could cut defense spending by more than 80%, and our actual role in the world would not change at all. If the U.S. dollar fell from its current position of 65% of global trade and global reserves by 80%, so to 20% or so, we would all be very poor. And this is something that Vladimir Putin really understands quite well. He has spoken about the dollar and dollar hegemony and its benefits for the United States and his perception of its costs for Russia since before he was anointed president at the end of 1999, and he has actively campaigned against it since around 2004 and 2005. There was, of course, his famous Munich speech in 2007, where he spoke at the Munich Security Conference and laid out a lot of sort of his beliefs about how the West had, in his views, treated Russia unfairly. But one of the points that I was very interested that he mentioned was that he specifically focused on the dollar role. So when I talk about the international economic order, what I really mean are the institutions that underpin that. The dollar itself, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. Those are, of course, United Nations institutions, but showing the sort of U.S. hegemony under them. They are the only ones that are based in Washington, D.C., not here in New York or in Geneva. And then the system of trade and finance that goes along with that. So whether that be the use of dollar currencies or the use of financial instruments to borrow, and in particular how emerging and developing countries borrow in foreign currencies. The US, of course, doesn't have this problem, but whereas it's Russia or Ukraine or even China, they all have substantial borrowings in dollars. And the one last point I'll give on sort of that top-level overview about the system is that I take a very different position from a lot of others about Russia and China's partnership. Right before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine last February, there was a summit at which China and Russia declared so-called friendship without limits. In reality, they have a partnership that doesn't even have real benefits for at least Russia. It certainly has many for China. And China broadly aims to replace the US as the core node of the international economic order, and they have a long-term strategy to do that. But they want to be on the top of the pile. Russia's strategy is to destroy the pile. They know that they will never be on the top, but that they can be a bigger dog in a heap of rubble than they can sort of at the top of these things. And the one last point I'll make about Vladimir Putin, at least at this stage in these things, is we so often see him as the spy who came in from the cold. And he was, of course, in the KGB in the Soviet era. His first senior job was in the Kremlin, was as head of the Federal Security Service, the FSB. But actually, Vladimir Putin's real success in the 1990s came from his economic nous and his understanding of a lot of these issues. So Vladimir Putin was on the board of a company called the St. Petersburg Real Estate Trust that had an IPO in Germany in 1995. Of course, now a lot of us are familiar with Russian oligarchs such as I'm trying to think who won't sue me for libel. Roman Abramovich, others who have their names plastered over buildings here in New York, libraries at Harvard, Oxford, and other places. Their sort of real wave of IPOs and entering the London market began in the late 1990s and then really peaked in the early 2000s. Vladimir Putin was already involved in 1995. As far back as 1992, he signed an agreement in his role as the assistant rector of Leningrad State University with Colgate-Palmolive to bring business in there. And it was actually for his economic understanding that he was brought into the Kremlin in 1998 rather than for his sort of security services skills. So one thing that I think is very important is that we have to understand that the Russians have a very good understanding of these issues. And often, particularly in London, where I'm based, we talk about Londongrad and sort of Britain as this butler to the world and helping create shell companies and doing all these things. And that is, of course, very true. We have done a lot of that, and I have a lot of criticisms of it, but a lot of it hasn't been without guidance and direction from Russia. They are very good at understanding a lot of these systems. And the real sort of point that I want to make about that is actually how the book begins, where I start this economic war, which is not with the sanctioning of Russia's central bank in 2022, or even the introduction of sanctions against Russia on a serious level back in 2014, but goes back to 2013. When we are speaking today, actually, it was just an hour and a half ago. Today is the 10-year anniversary of the Euromaidan protests in Kyiv, the ones that resulted in the successful revolution in February of 2014. But they began 10 years ago today, and of course the ramifications are still being felt. But it was on the 17th of December that the first protester was killed by the Berkut security forces, who were, of course, Ukrainian security forces. One's very loyal to then-President Viktor Yanukovych, who has been in Russia since 2014. I'm certainly happy to talk later about questions about how long he was a sort of Russian stooge for. It is a complicated issue. But one of the things that I really hark on and how I begin the book is that on the the same day that the first protester was killed, 10 years ago today, is when Russia started its economic war against the West in its serious form that has resulted in the inflation and so many of the economic difficulties that we've seen over the last 18 months, which is that on that same day, Viktor Yanukovych flew to Moscow. And in Moscow, he met with Putin. He flew there together with a very prominent Ukrainian oligarch, Dmytro Firtash, who has since switched sides, which I think certainly highlights how large the ramifications of these things are within Ukraine in particular. But on that day, he signed a bailout agreement with Putin, where Putin agreed to give Ukraine $15 billion in exchange for Yanukovych formally abandoning Ukraine's Western ambitions, abandoning the plans to sign what's called an association agreement, which crucially includes a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, DCFTA as it's known, with Ukraine, and instead to join Russia's rival bloc, the Eurasian Economic Union. Now, what was really interesting about this was the form of this loan came in not a sort of standard loan from one government to another, but used an instrument called a Eurobond, which are how countries borrow in debts that aren't in the currency that they issue. This bond was actually issued in dollars. Now, when you read about Argentina defaulting, as has sort of been in the news again potentially recently, or other countries running out of them, usually the canary in the coal mine is troubles with the Eurobond, and non-payment on the Eurobond is what formally triggers a country's sovereign default. For governments to use them to lend to one another, however, is extremely rare, and until that point was unheard of. What was so unique about this was that not only did Russia use this Eurobond to lend to Ukraine, but through some very pliant lawyers in London, structured it in a way that gave it leverage over Ukraine for the foreseeable future. They used the instruments and the tools of the international economic order to undermine it itself. And this ultimately was only 3 billion were sold as a result of the Ukrainian successful revolution that February. But the core terms of this treaty meant that Russia could push Ukraine into a state of default, effectively bankrupting Ukraine at any point that it wanted to, under the legal contracts, under English law, of this instrument. Crucially, when that did happen, when Ukraine did run out of money the next year due to Russia's invasion, of course, we talk about it now so often as having begun last February, but Russia annexed Crimea in March of 2014 and started its invasion of eastern Ukraine in the provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk back then, used this instrument not only to challenge Ukraine, but because of how the structure of international finance works, where formally when a country runs out of money, it has two separate sort of pockets of creditors, right? It has the other countries that it owes money to, known as its official creditors. That also includes the institutions like the International Monetary Fund. And this bond let Russia try to have a say in both camps, essentially. They tried to both block the restructuring, which was led by actually a New York-based firm, Franklin Templeton, and the IMF. Ultimately, this tool was diffused, but only after we changed the rules. And now I've spoken to the IMF many times. I've gone to their conferences and I've asked them about this. And they've always said, of course, we did not change the rules because of Russia's action. It has nothing to do with that. They, of course, have to take that language because we do at least claim the rules-based order. What I would say is what makes the rules-based order so strong is the U.S.'s position to change the rules when it suits us. And I don't say that entirely critically. Often in many cases, like in Ukraine's, I think it's a very good thing. But the actual rule change, to sort of rebut the IMF's comments there, the actual rule change that occurred was only announced in 2 languages, in Russian and English. So I think it was pretty obvious what audience they were speaking to. I won't go into all the technicalities of the rule change here, but if any of you are interested, or anyone online is interested, obviously I'm happy to try to answer them later. I then want to move on to how this fight really spread around the world. And I'll use that by telling you another quick story, which is of myself, looking with much more hair, almost 10 years ago now, and this gentleman on the right. This is Igor Sechin. He was Vladimir Putin's chief of staff in the 1990s, and he has, for over 13 years now, served as the head of Rosneft, the Russian state oil company, the dominant oil company in Russia, which also came about through a series of complicated Russian actions, essentially expropriating it from another Russian businessman, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, some of which story is told in Bill Browder's books and histories of Russia in the early 2000s. But what I thought so remarkable about this, and while I strongly don't recommend shaking hands with war criminals, I had to get this photo because this photo was taken 7 days after Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in the Wannsee outside Berlin, which some of you may know is where the Nazis agreed what they called the final solution, the Holocaust. And it was a German business group that had invited this man here, there, less than a week after he had been sanctioned by the United States, and held him as an honored figure and welcomed him incredibly kindly. Feted is even is perhaps the right word, but I would say more significant than that. And he was allowed to not only talk about sort of the evils of the United States, but his wonderful plans to supply Germany with lots of new oil, eventually natural gas. Of course, the Nord Stream 2 pipelines, which were destroyed in an explosion last year, were just being planned at this time. And he even went so far as to say that he wanted to build a whole bunch of nuclear power plants, which some of you may know Germany has lots of issues with, in Kaliningrad, the former Königsberg, the Russian exclave between Poland and Lithuania. But it was really a failure in Europe to understand what was at stake, as well as in the United States a little bit, but really in Europe that let this conflict spread so quickly. Russia, of course, found key allies in Germany who allowed it to build the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in the first place, but also really spread the conflict around the world. And so it's a little small and hard to see here, but it is in the front of the book and in the back, so you can have a look at it. But this map tries to cover all of the areas covered in the book where the conflict spread to. And some of the ones that I'd really like to point your attention to are Caracas down in Venezuela and India, because they've played really key roles. In Russia, essentially used Venezuela as a laboratory to test out a lot of its strategies for sanctions busting. In Syria, it did so as well, but there it was really much more about just shifting oil back and forth. So they essentially learned to play three-card Monte with shell companies and structure them to try to keep them out of sanctions. But it was in Venezuela that they created a cryptocurrency, Russians created it, called El Petro, that was meant to enable Venezuela to get around US sanctions imposed in 2018. And it was in India, which has now in the last year and a half gone from almost importing no Russian oil whatsoever to being the largest importer of Russian oil in the world, and with almost a third of its imports coming from Russia, where they were able to buy the second largest refinery in the country. Uniquely, they structured their deal in India in a way that very clearly violated the spirit of sanctions, but not the letter of it. And they were so happy about it, they couldn't resist bragging about it. The head of a Russian state bank, some officials from Rosneft with Mr. Sechin, really played a very key role in doing this. And they bragged about it to the Financial Times and to Reuters. And I think a failure to understand what was at stake and how Russia was trying to challenge the US dollar's role in this international economic order really let us be kind of lax with regards to it. And the great question that many people ask, and that of course the book tries to help answer, is, do sanctions work? Are they effective? And I think that these stories kind of paint an interesting role about that, because the way that we approached Russia with sanctions after 2014 and the initial invasion was to try to use them as a deterrent tool. To try to say, if you do X, Y, and Z, then Z, sorry, I forget the audience. If you do X, Y, and Z, then we will sanction you. If you don't do them, then maybe we'll lessen the sanctions. Throughout the history of sanctions, their use as a deterrent tool has been very, very ineffective for countries with which we don't have good relations, right? So whether it be Iran or for much longer periods of time, Cuba and North Korea. We've had sanctions on Cuba for almost 70 years now. The Cuban government does not take any actions that we like or has not shifted its ideology or politics in a more pro-Western way at any point due to them. Sanctions do not work against antagonistic states as a deterrent tool. They do, however, work, and we've seen that the Biden administration is starting to recognize this, and Biden's op-ed in the Washington Post just this week, where he threatened sanctions against the Israeli settler movement for the first time. They do work really well against countries with whom we are allies. So the European countries that all oppose Trump's unilateral withdrawal from the Iran deal and the reintroduction of sanctions on Iran, none of them went and violated them. The sort of core example is South Korea in the 1950s and early 1960s was not a democratic state at that time. It was a dictatorship, a pro-Western capitalist one, but they wanted their own nuclear weapons, and we threatened them with sanctions, and they pretty quickly dropped that plan. There's some talk about it again for the first time in almost 60 years in South Korea again now in the current geopolitical environment. But sanctions do not work as a deterrent tool against your opponents. Where sanctions do work, and where we've seen this historically, whether it be with Russia today, or it be with Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, is sanctions do really work as a tool of war by other means. So, of course, we have mutually assured destruction with Russia. The idea of direct war between the United States or even the European Union or United Kingdom and Russia is frankly unthinkable because of the nuclear fallout that would result. But we do have this power through our use and influence of the dollar system, and the U.S. is very unique in that we are the only country that applies extraterritoriality to our sanctions. So any transaction involving the dollar, even if it's between fishermen in Greenland and his ultimate end customer in Timbuktu, Mali, still comes under, in our view, the purview of sanctions, whereas other countries do not do that. And, we talk a lot now about Russia in terms of sanctions and the oil cap, and they're selling oil above $60 again and the like. And sanctions are not a perfect tool. They are never something you can press the button on and sort of just cause the opponent to cave and turn over. But those things have all had really significant costs for Russia. Of course, today the Russian ruble trades at nearly 100 rubles to the dollar. When all of this began, it's a sort of crude tool and often leads to misleading analysis, but the Russian ruble traded at under 30 before 2014. And the sort of real tragedy that I want to make and that we point out and that we have to understand with regards to Russia is the Russian living standard has never returned to its 2013 level. And we have to accept, as tragic as it is, because I got interested in Russia and sort of began pursuing my studies there, not because I thought that we would fight an economic war with them, but because I really like Russians. But the reality is that Vladimir Putin doesn't care about the economic well-being of his citizens. He cares far more about the capacity of his state, and he will continue to prioritize that for probably as long as he is in office, and which is almost certainly as long as he's alive. Russia does have elections next March, but they're not really competitive. So, sanctions do work, but we can't think about them as a magic tool, but in this case, with regards to Russia, they're the best we have, essentially. The next point I went too far. How do I go back? Oh. Now I've gone back too far. Maybe I'm pointing it in the wrong way. There we go. Right. The one other point I want to make is what happened in 2022. Of course, we're all still living with the cost of inflation that has spiked since the end of the COVID pandemic today. Although it's starting to come down, I'll talk in the end why I think we shouldn't be too comfortable in that. Which is that Russia began preparing for this war even before the full-scale invasion in last February, of course, really in the summer of 2021 when it began moving large amounts of troops to the Ukrainian border. That's when relations with Russia and the United States really deteriorated. There was supposed to be another meeting between Biden and Putin. There was one at the beginning of the year, and then the next one was canceled. And when we sort of started really hearing about this. But again, going back to Russia's very good understanding of these matters, that's also when we started feeling real inflationary pressure in the West, something that we hadn't experienced in my entire adult lifetime, largely as a result of the bottlenecks and supply chains that came out of the COVID pandemic. It was exactly at that time that Russia started using its economic levers over Europe. Back in July of 2021, they already stopped flows on the original Nord Stream pipeline and two other pipelines from Russia to Europe, and essentially tried to make very clear that they were willing to take the economic components of this war to drive them apart. And that's where I think Putin really miscalculated. Putin thought that the economic costs that this would bring for Europe in particular, which are huge. The German petrochemical industry, one of the key drivers of its economy, is, and I make this prediction in the book, and I still hold to it now, is within 3 years going to be almost entirely dead. Even today, German naphtha use, key ingredient in petrochemicals, is at its lowest level in 50 years because it's cheaper to ship it from the United States over there. One of the other things that they also were very good at realizing, that we were slow to realize, was the development of a global natural gas market. So natural gas prices 10 years ago, when they spiked in the United States, or if they spiked in Asia because of increased demand from China or Japan, had very little impact on one another. Today, because of the development of the global LNG market, which of course has enabled Europe to find alternative gas supplies, but because of that, there is much more correlation between the gas price, natural gas, not petrol gas, that we use here today in Europe and around the world. One of the biggest victims of this economic war actually was Pakistan, which had a wonderful strategy that had sort of done everything that it was recommended to do. It had bought long-term gas contracts. They had really driven LNG as a sort of core source of energy for their market, but because all of their contracts didn't envisage this and included break clauses, everyone who was supplying Pakistan with natural gas last year canceled their contracts and sold it to Europe instead, because the price of canceling the contract was less than a tenth of the profits that they could make to selling it to Europe. So Putin saw this economic weapon as something key that he needed to keep Europe out of the fight, but also something that would help spread this around the world, and which we've seen more recently with some of the agricultural fights around the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and Russia, of course, offering what it calls free grain to African countries, the first shipment of which departed Russia just last week. But the real full-scale invasion, obviously, what came on the 24th of February last year, terribly timed with my brother's birthday. But it was then that the West finally realized that we had tools that we could use in response, that weren't just about deterring Russia, but were about attacking its state capacity. We went after the Russian central bank and most of Russia's largest banks through cutting them off from the SWIFT system, the interbank messaging system. This is the largest country targeted by sanctions since before World War II. There's a wonderful book that I'll recommend you read called The Economic Weapon, about sanctions before World War II and during it. But I think the sort of key thing that it misunderstands is that capital didn't move freely at that point. Of course, we had the Bretton Woods Agreement after World War II, the U.S.'s withdrawal from that, putting the dollar as the sort of key trade instrument and key reserve instrument from 1971 onwards. but capital really could move freely, and that causes an entirely different battlefield. Russia is now one of the countries through which capital can no longer move freely, and that is a relatively rare thing, although of course many countries have their own capital controls. But the real impact of this, what I think the sort of simplest way to explain it to someone, is that if you have $1 here in your pocket, or you have $1 at home, or I have $1 that I've left back at my apartment in London, or $1 sitting on Cash App on my phone, or Venmo, or whatever it is, all those dollars are equal, they're all worth the same. $1, as soon as it crosses the border with Russia, whether that be the digital border or the physical border, immediately loses value compared to $1 anywhere else in the world. What the Russians are fighting for is to try to keep that dollar basically worth 99 cents. What our sanctions aim to do is to try to drive the value of that dollar down towards 50 cents or even lower. The best estimates we have are out of Iran because of the times of sanctions there. In Iran, $1 is worth roughly 60 cents anywhere else because of all the hassles you have to go through to get it out. But Putin, I think the reason that he miscalculated around this issue was really not out of an economic one or anything else, but really out of a societal and cultural one, which is that Ukraine is, of course, a European country on the northern side of the Black Sea. And European countries, therefore, very much felt themselves a threat. We just this September saw the second war in 3 years between Armenia and Azerbaijan, a tragic conflict that occurred just on the other side of the Black Sea, and in which, frankly, one side has engaged in quite serious atrocities and used its economic power as leverage in a very similar way. But there's almost no discussion of sanctions that results from that because, frankly, it's on the other side of the Black Sea and we don't care as much in Europe. So, I think that was really the key driver in that. The final point I want to make here is that Russia has really changed as a result of this from a state of autocratic capitalism to an autarky. Because of Russia's oil and gas and other mineral wealth, it certainly is no North Korea, but the economy is increasingly being driven in that direction. One of the predictions that I make, and that I'll reiterate here, is that in 5 years' time, Russia will not have multiple oil and gas companies and will not have multiple various mining companies. The Kremlin will eventually take them all in under one. I have many Russian friends who were entrepreneurs and the like, and incredibly smart people, and it's frankly just impossible to set up a business there now, and there is no real sort of spoils left to go out because Russia's now spending more than 6% of GDP on the war. Really what's left is an increasingly small pie that Putin can divvy up amongst his friends. And this is where we have something potentially to look forward to, which is, it's very hard to say how long this will take, but that real bargain that Putin had with the Russian people, known as холодильник телевизор in Russian, the refrigerator versus the television, that so long as the television was full and the refrigerator was full and the television had propaganda on it, that the Russian people would accept the increased lack of democracy in their country is really gone. And that sort of fighting within elites is something that's very hard for us to understand as outsiders, even those of us who have spent a lot of time in Russia, but is the kind of thing that we see exactly in, of course, the events that have taken place since the book was published with the Prigozhin putsch. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Russia's Wagner group, who launched this sort of abortive mutiny earlier this summer, and then later died in a mysterious plane explosion along with two of his senior-most lieutenants. The Russian sense of forgiveness is a cruel one. So, it's very hard to say how long all of that will play out. But bringing to my final point, which that I want to do is that as a result, this is a war that Russia can't win, but we in the West can lose by failing to understand that what we're fighting for and how we're doing it. The tragic congressional impasse that we've seen of late with ridiculous debates about whether to default rather than whether to support the Ukrainians are exactly the kind of things that I'm talking about. But showing just how weak Russia's position is in these things, of course, in August of this year, there was the latest BRICS summit. This is the summit of Brazil, Russia, India, China, the countries that Russia hopes can build up an alternative currency. And because of the strength of the international economic order, Putin couldn't even go to the summit in Johannesburg because, of course, South Africa is a signatory to the treaties on the International Criminal Court. I do want to say, though, that South Africa has violated those treaties before. Omar al-Bashir, the former dictator of Sudan, 8 years ago now, did visit South Africa when he was under indictment, but Putin couldn't do it because the U.S. used its sanctions threats against South Africa. We effectively caught them shipping goods and fuel to a Russian warship that they shouldn't have been doing and said, well, we'll hit you with sanctions if you let Putin come to this summit. So of course he couldn't. A lot of the threat is here in the United States, and we do have a know-nothing nativist movement that doesn't see the value of the U.S. position in the international economic order. But of course we have a lot of that on the European continent as well. And this is where I want to make one final point on this order is, the idea that's gained traction for the first time in recent years that European countries should somehow spend 2% of defense 2% of GDP on defense to pay their own fair share in defending themselves while they've improved since the Russian full-scale invasion. If every European country, every EU member, and every NATO member in Europe hits 2% of defense, of GDP spending on defense, and the U.S. were to decrease its defense budget by 15%, all of that increase would be gone. The real alliance that we have with Europe is that despite the European financial crisis of 10 years ago, the European Union is the only country in the world, or the only bloc in the world that has built up an alternative currency system since the Bretton Woods era. The euro is used for more than 90% of transactions within the European Union, but the dollar still dominates European Union transactions internationally. And effectively, the deal that we have with Europe that we need to be better about understanding, both in Europe and the United States, is, frankly, the United States provides the security guarantee, and in exchange, Europe remains a part of this dollar order. And for Russia or China or any of these BRICS countries to ever be successful at building up an alternative system, they need a bloc like Europe or the United States, which has a stable and trustworthy credit and deficit market in which they can invest their excess savings, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, these are all countries that run surpluses, whereas we run deficits, but that all have very, what's the right way to put it, untrustworthy capital markets. Very few people want to hold Chinese bonds abroad. I'll finish with really this fight, far more than any other conflict going on in the world right now, as tragic and horrible as many of those are, and I hope for peace in all of them, this is the one where both the West's position and in particular the United States' position is really most at risk. And I really do want to emphasize the point I made at the beginning once again at the end, which is that if Russia is able to win in this conflict and drive the United States and Europe apart, it won't be immediate and it won't be overnight, but that will be the actual beginning of the end of the dollar system and the strengths that we have. And what I think the simplest and punchiest way to say that is that if Russia is successful in taking over the half of Ukraine that Putin envisages, eventually the dollar's role in the international system will be gone, and we will all be far poorer as a result. And so even if one doesn't ascribe to the ideas about European security or the liberal order or the like, and one only cares about one's own pocketbook, which I'm not saying is how one should view the world, but even if that is how one does, then undoubtedly this conflict and Russia's tragic invasion of Ukraine is not only the most important event of the last 10 years, but is likely to be the most important event of the next few years as well, because Putin sadly has no plans on giving up this fight, and I think it's imperative that we continue to support Ukraine and that we continue to take the right actions as the West writ large to underpin, understand, and support our own system better. And with that, thank you all for listening to me, and I hope that you'll have some questions for me. Anyone want to raise their hand and try a question? Other than my sister, who obviously wants. Yes. Please.
Well, how long do you think this can last? And, given the waning interest in different places and stuff.
So I am very worried about support in the West, and I think that's going to be the real key test over the next year. Of course, we have very crucial elections here in the United States next year, but there are many important elections coming up in Europe before that, whether it be the Dutch elections right now. And one of my favorite stories in the book is actually about how the Dutch could have done so much more to support all this, because there's over 60 billion cubic meters per year of natural gas sitting in the Netherlands that they refuse to touch because it causes a few tiny earthquakes. Literally for the same price that the European Union spent last year defending gas markets, they could have bought every single person in the affected area a $1 million house in the south of France, which would have been a much nicer thing to do. But of course, the European Union elections next year and then the United Kingdom elections next year. Russia as an autarkic, non-democratic, belligerent state. How long can that last? I mean, the Soviet Union lasted 70 years. Vladimir Putin is probably not going to live another 70 years, but when it comes to all the theories that he's dead or about to die or the like, I always use the Russian expression trust but verify, and then I've had very smart Russians tell me that this is definitely going to happen, but of course we can't verify it, so I don't think we can make any assumptions on it, and this is where I hope that our politicians here were more honest. We have to accept that it's not about when this is going to end, it's about accepting that this is the reality for the foreseeable future. There is no end in sight, and Vladimir Putin hopes that essentially he can hold out longer than the West can.
Could you describe for us who don't follow this, the economy of Ukraine before Russia's invasion?
Sure. There's one chapter really dedicated to the Ukrainian economy, and in particular the changes that it's undergone, which is Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. It is one of the most agriculturally rich countries in the world. Its famed Black Earth, Chornozem, is not only amongst the most fruitful soil in the world, but it's thanks to it that we even understand so much of modern agricultural science came out of Russians and Ukrainians studying it 100 years ago. Ukraine's industrial economy, however, was really something that is a legacy of the Soviet Union. It had very large steel factories, very large rocket factories, and others that had really sort of been left decrepit in the years after 1991, and Ukraine had one of the highest living standards in the Soviet era, certainly in the late Soviet era. But really something that had been left to fester and rot due to the corrupting influence of local oligarchs. And that's the real difference between Russia and Ukraine before this war, which is that for all the sort of glitz and glamour and attention that the oligarchs get, and I'm thinking about Abramovich, who I mentioned earlier, he does have 3 houses sitting down the street that are still empty. Hopefully someone can find something good to do with them. The real difference is that Putin had effectively forced the oligarchs to be loyal to him in the early 2000s and say, you will be part of my system or it will be over for you. Khodorkovsky, the one who he took the oil company from, was the one who he sort of made an example of. But in Ukraine, it was really the oligarchs who dominated Ukrainian politics, and their loyalties would often shift. As I said at the beginning, Rinat Akhmetov is a very powerful Ukrainian oligarch who was sort of the key funder of the pro-Russian party before the revolution in 2014. Today is a key funder of Ukraine's defense efforts, and his assets, which include steel mills, but most significantly, most of Ukraine's power infrastructure are amongst those that have been targeted most in the war. Today, a lot of that industrial infrastructure due to this war is sadly no longer operable. The key Russian offensive we see right now ahead of the winter is outside the city of Donetsk for a town called Avdiivka, where it has the largest coking coal factory in Europe. That factory has been idled since the full-scale invasion last year, remarkably operated for 8 years before that at sort of the front line of the war. But without it, the Ukrainian steel industry is effectively dead because you need that coking coal to get in there. Otherwise, Ukraine did in previous
previous years import some from South Africa and other places to make up for it. But that's sort of just one example. But Ukraine has a huge amount of promise if it can be returned to peace as a result of not only some of that infrastructure which still exists, but really its people. And Ukrainians today are an incredibly entrepreneurial, incredibly smart group of people, to the point where so many of the largest technology companies in Europe have a plurality of coders who are actually Ukrainians. Some of them are based in other places in the region that have suffered from Russia's war. In Tbilisi in Georgia, a place very close to my own heart, they've really benefited from this, bringing a lot of those Ukrainians have been able to build new lives for themselves there and work there. But one of the sort of fascinating things that I've always found about the region, whether it be from Russia's war in 2014 or Russia's previous invasion of Georgia in 2008, is that there's not only a sense of patriotism amongst the young people, but including those who've been successful abroad, that they want to go back home and really contribute to their own societies. And so, if the sort of war were to all of a sudden, if Putin were to get hit by a lightning strike today, in which case I do think the war would end very quickly, because I do think Putin will go down as a traitor to the Russian people for his own statements about Ukraine through this in the history books. The Ukrainian economy would be, frankly, in a very, very weak position, except for its incredible wealth in these agricultural supplies. But it has an incredible amount of promise going forward if only they can have peace. And the success of Ukrainians that we've seen, whether it be in Georgia or in London or elsewhere, really speaks to that and gives me a lot of hope. But in terms of talking about the Ukrainian economy now, from its industrial base compared to what it was in 2013, which even then Ukraine was one of the poorest countries in Europe, is a fraction of what it once was.
Question over here.
Oh, my brother.
Yeah. Hi, Max. Great presentation. Really enjoyed it. Could you maybe contrast Putin, who takes this sort of long view, many steps ahead approach to disrupting the international economic order, as you sort of framed it, to Xi, who seems to show his hand? Is it just Xi's incompetence that he's like, as soon as there's a flare up over some issue, he's like, well, I disagree with the Western order and it's unfair, blah, blah, and Putin's a bit more nuanced about it by all sides. How do you compare and contrast their approaches?
So I actually think that Xi is much smarter. I think Putin is very good at understanding the structure of the order, but very bad at understanding how to actually effectively challenge it, which is something I myself learned as a young man. If you want to change something's rules, it's always better to do it from within than from without. I think that, as I said earlier, Putin really sees destroying the international economic order as far more of his priority rather than trying to be atop of a new order, whereas Xi really sees himself as eventually bringing China to be atop it. So, just today we had some big news out of Saudi Arabia, or yesterday, out of Saudi Arabia and China, with those two countries signing a swap agreement to buy about 7% of Saudi oil in the future with Chinese yuan instead of with the US dollar. Where Xi, I think, really has an advantage in this thing is we are so bad at understanding the international economic order and the US dollar's role in it in the West that we actually, one of the remarkable things is that we got there by mistake, right? The withdrawal from the Bretton Woods Agreement, or the two agreements in the 1980s that really supported it, the PASA and the Louvre Accords, were all aimed at actually weakening the US dollar and changing its role, but ended up making it even more important for global trade and global reserves. Where we so often, fail to ever talk about the US dollar and its order in US hegemony. We're very happy to talk about defense budgets and the US military and, our love of sending troops to the Middle East as things to defend this order. But really, it's far more about structures like what's known as the petrodollar, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, where they effectively refurb the Saudis. The best way I heard it, and I can never remember who said it, is, actually the 2010s were this wonderful era where you had this dictator in Saudi Arabia taking all the excess money that he earned from oil, giving it to the son of immigrants in Japan, Mahayoshi's son, who then took that money and invested it in the United States and funded our millennial lifestyles by funding WeWork and Uber and Deliveroo and all these things. And there's actually a lot of truth to that. I'm not saying that Mohammed bin Salman is a great guy or that Mahayoshi's son is the best investor I've ever heard of. But this sort of petrodollar system and this rewashing of the excess money that Saudi Arabia and other countries earn in the West is something that we often fail to understand. Xi, I think, has a really good understanding of how China can position itself in the long term. So that, we talk a lot about Taiwan or Xinjiang, where China's actions are inexcusable and horrific. But what I'm really interested in are China's strategy of signing bilateral investment treaties and setting up its own arbitration courts at home, and building up the infrastructure that it needs to eventually replace the U.S. as this core node of the international economic order. And I think China has a very long-term strategy to do that, right? China still has domestic capital controls. You can't move more than roughly $50,000 out of China without getting the government's permission there. Eventually, what China needs to do is to build up its own credit markets and to build up its own reserve assets that are seen as credible. And this is where I see the Belt and Road as a real strategy. People often talk about the Belt and Road, they want to take over this port in Sri Lanka, or they want to control a railway in Kenya. And frankly, they do not care about a railway in Kenya or the amount of people who do it. What they really care about is having a domestic debt market that people not only domestically within China are interested in, but that other countries are interested in. The death of the dollar, if it does happen, is not something that will be gradual from the US dollar going of roughly 60% of reserves and trade down to 20%, but it's something that will happen when China has open capital markets, where when there's a crisis in the Middle East, or there's a COVID, or there's a crisis coming out of the US, like the mortgage crisis, right? All of those crises that we've seen in the last 15 years or so, what's happened in each one of them is that people take their money and they shove it into US treasuries and they go and support the system because that's the asset of last resort. China hopes that one day when there's that crisis that people will go and put it into some kind of Chinese paper. And the fact that China has a very good understanding of these issues and this structure leads me to believe that they are a real long-term competitor and a long-term threat, but I do not think China is going to invade Taiwan anytime soon. I really believe that China looks at what Russia has done and goes, wow, what a bunch of morons. I think that China really poses sort of the long-term threat there, but that we can get there and compete with them in a matter that is far more about economics than it is about people's direct lives. And I certainly hope that remains the case, and that's something I very much worry about here. We see this in some political debate now. People say, we need to get Russia out of China's corner because China is real threat. For me, what I'm far more worried about is that China will see Russia's actions as an opportunity rather than as a threat, right? So right now, Putin wants three things from from China. He wants direct military support for the war in Ukraine. He's not getting it other than some helmets. He wants direct loans from China to Russia to make up the lack of access Russia has to Western capital markets. Chinese loans to Russia increased by 700% last year. When I say 700%, though, you still have to remember that's under 15% of what Western loans were to Russia in 2021. So it's growing, but from a very, very small base, and certainly far less than what the West did immediately before it. And then the third thing that he wants is, of course, a deal on the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, this key Russian gas pipeline that they've been planning on building for many years now to sell Russian gas to China now that the European market is cut off. And the first one was agreed in 2014 and opened in 2020. Xi got a great deal on that because of Putin's decision to invade and invite sanctions on himself in 2014. What we can infer from Chinese customs data, although China doesn't, report these things publicly in terms of the actual contract price. It seems that China pays Russia less for natural gas than it does to Myanmar or Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan, not countries that have any geopolitical power yet, let alone seats on, the UN Security Council. So, I think China will continue playing this to its advantage, but it has a much more longer-term strategy, and when we think about it, we have to think about it far less as some kind of Russian-Chinese axis, but rather that China takes an incredibly different approach. And I'm not saying that I want to live in a world where arbitration courts decide investment disputes in China, or where our ultimate safety reserve assets are Chinese bonds rather than U.S. bonds. But I think that's a competition we can have on the merits of our judicial, economic, and political systems, rather than one fought not only with these economic weapons, but with the lives of people in neighboring countries, as Vladimir Putin is so clearly willing to do. Yeah.
Don't know how to ask this question, but with this, the issue of Ukraine and the economic war, focusing solely on that issue, and we've had Biden is leading the U.S. for the past 2.5 years. We had a prior president for 4 years leading up to the invasion, and he's very active. Trump is in his speech by now. Focusing solely on this issue, how big an impact would a change in leadership in this country between Biden and Trump impact the situation?
So, one of the key bits that happened in the Trump's administration the first time was that really Congress took over policy on this matter. So in 2017, we had something called the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, known as CATSA. There were also a few other bills proposed, one that ultimately effectively laid the groundwork for the sanctions that we have today, which Lindsey Graham actually introduced. Congress was able to really play a driving role in the Trump administration, and I am personally no fan of Donald Trump, but I certainly am also not a believer that he's somehow loyal to Putin or has some kind of Putin has some kind of compromise over him. But what I would point out is that there's been a lot of talk lately about the U.S. sanctions and going after Russia, that this threatens the dollar's role because other people aren't going to trust the U.S. dollar because look at what we did to Russia's assets. The only time the largest decrease in the U.S. dollar share as a result of global trade and international reserves actually happened in the first 2.5 years of the Trump administration, because frankly bankers in Singapore don't care about what we do in Russia, but they did care about Donald Trump and didn't trust him and worry about him. So I think it would be an accelerant on that front. And secondly, I don't think that if Trump were to be reelected, that there is enough of the traditional Republican Party left to challenge him. Trump, of course, signed CATSA with a very stinging signing statement, basically saying na 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 na, but I'm going to sign this anyway. Whereas today, I don't think that the Republicans, if they controlled Congress, could pass legislation that Trump wasn't himself willing to fully endorse. The Republican Party has become the party of Donald Trump. I hope that it's not that way for the rest of my life, but it's definitely going to be that way for the next election cycle. And frankly, I think that Donald Trump is the single greatest threat to U.S. political power as a result of his misunderstanding of this conflict and the fact that he would give Russia, Donald Trump's strategy to solve this conflict is to give Russia at least a third of Ukraine. He said that very openly. The impacts that will have on the U.S.-European alliance, not to mention his threats to withdraw from NATO and the like, will be the beginning of the end for the international order as we know it now.
We have a question in the live stream that I think jumps off from what you just said, actually. Do you see any scenario where Ukraine regains all of the territory currently occupied by Russia, or will they have to concede land for peace? If they move in that direction, would the Europeans or would the U.S. support a land for peace settlement?
Sure. the thing that I'll say is Vladimir Putin claims to already that not only all of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions and Crimea, where this conflict began in 2014, but also all of the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. In his view, he has annexed them and they are part of Russia in his constitution. So Putin is very clear that he will only accept a peace deal that includes all of those territories, although he has at no point in any of this conflict controlled all of them, or all of even a single one of them, except for Crimea. I think it will be very, I am not a military expert, but I have the good fortune of getting to speak to some pretty regularly. I think it will be very difficult for the Ukrainians on the battlefield anytime soon, even if they do get F-16s at the beginning of next year, to militarily retake the rest of the country. We will eventually be looking at a frozen conflict, something that Russia has a huge amount of experience in, whether it be in Georgia or Moldova or in Ukraine previously, using to its advantage. And as crass and harsh it is, we have to look and start thinking now about how we can use a frozen conflict, in this case, to our own advantage. And the point that I would make here is the reality is that some of the things Vladimir Putin said before his full-scale invasion and justifying it, you may remember he wrote a piece that was published here in the National Review called "On the Historical Unity of Russian and Ukrainian Peoples." There's a lot of truth to that. There are incredibly close ties between Russians and Ukrainians, closer than Spanish and Portuguese even, and which I myself have gotten to experience a lot there. But it is Putin who has become the true father of Ukrainian nationalism. There's Taras Shevchenko, the great poet. There's, of course, the controversial World War II figures who Putin likes to blame everything on. Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the Ukrainian Cossack leader in the 16th century, 17th century, who did all this. But in my travels in southern eastern Ukraine, I met many people who did identify as Russian. Say, look, if we could vote, we would go and we would join Russia, but we care about our local livelihoods, and so we'll make our decisions on that basis. One family who I stayed with in Mariupol, and there are those from Mariupol who have gone to Russia. Now the daughter lives in Milan, where she refuses to speak Russian and has the Ukrainian national symbol tattooed up her arm. Her parents live in Lviv in the far west of Ukraine, sort of the hub of nationalism. And I think that in the long run, Putin will go down as a traitor to the Russian people, and that there will be a speech not long after he is out of power, very similar to Khrushchev's, so-called secret speech about Stalin, throwing him under the bus and changing it, about Putin, precisely because he has birthed this Ukrainian nationalism in so many of those regions that he aims to control. So even if Putin can hold on to them for the foreseeable future, eventually he has lost the war unless we basically hand it to him on a platter. And I think that is going to be really significant for not only Ukraine's future and the actual where the territory ends up, but the future of what kind of Russia comes next after Putin.
Thank you. I'm seeing maybe two more questions. Is that good?
Yeah.
What effect on the centrality of the dollar is the downgrading of the debt that has happened in the last year or so?
Of the U.S. dollar? The U.S. downgrades?
Yeah.
Almost none.
What's that?
Zero.
Really?
Yeah, zero.
Do you repeat the question?
The question was, what is the impact of, I think it was Standard & Poor's that is now, or Moody's that is now joined in downgrading the U.S. from AAA to BB+. So this was considered a potential risk factor when it first happened around 10 years ago, because some bank and pension contracts said in there they had to have AAA rated assets. Those have all been adjusted to and changed so that they now say AAA rated assets or government securities. The actual sort of market structure impact of those downgrades, in my view, is effectively zero. As I said earlier, though, the risk to the U.S. dollar and U.S. credit is not the slow decline, but eventually in a crisis, what's the Orwell line? Gradually and then all at once. Is that in the crisis, the money moves elsewhere. So, the U.S. dollar's role in both international trade and in finance as a result of the downgrades is minimal.
How many people died in this war?
on the Ukrainian side and on the Russian side,
Are we including civilians or do you just soldiers?
including the civilians.
So, sadly, we don't have access to data from territory that Russia occupies now. Ukraine also does not release military casualties. In between 2014 and 2022, we know that around 18,000 civilians were killed. We estimate that since February of last year, more than 50,000 civilians have been killed, and probably more than 100,000 Ukrainian and Russian soldiers each. So we're looking at a death toll of 250,000 minimum. There are estimates that those numbers are quite a fair bit higher. And for Russia, just to put that in context, more Russians have died waging Putin's war in Ukraine since February of 2022 than died in every single war the Soviet Union waged after World War II put together. It was only 12,000 Soviet soldiers who died in the 11 years that the Soviet Union was in Afghanistan. And this is having a real impact on Russia's economy, particularly in terms of job availability. And one of the real sort of key questions that remains is the Central Asian countries get a lot of attention because of, the New York Times had a big splash earlier this year about washing machines getting shipped to Kazakhstan, and then those washing machines for the computer chips that they have being sent on to Russia. But the real question for me is, to what extent does Russia try to use them as essentially a population sponge to replace its own lack of workers? Historically, of course, there's a lot of racism against Central Asian migrants in Russia. So that is a factor that will change things there. But it is changing the color and view of Russian society. And once again, just as in the aftermath of World War II, although certainly not as stark, you have effectively a large deficit of young men. And that one other point that I'll just make on that is Russia still, and this is something that propagandistically is something that they are very keen to talk about, Russia does not conscript women, it does not involve women in the conflict in any way. Based on the best estimates that we have, roughly 15% of Ukrainian soldiers and volunteers are female.
What percentage, I'm sorry?
15.
15?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Maximilian Hess. Thank you, audience members.
Thank you for coming.